Postmodern Condition by Jean-Francois Lyotard. Answering the question, what is postmodernism? A demand. This is a period of slackening. I refer to the color of the times. From every direction, we are being urged to put an end to experimentation in the arts and elsewhere. I have read an art historian who extols realism and is militant for the advent of a new subjectivity. I have read an art critic who packages and sells trans-avant-gardism in the marketplace of painting. I have read that under the name of postmodernism, architects are getting rid of the Bauhaus project, throwing out the baby of experimentation with the bathwater of functionalism. I have read that a new philosopher is discovering what he drolly calls Judeo-Christianism and intends by it to put an end to the impiety which we are supposed to have spread. I have read in a French weekly that some are displeased with Mille Plateaux by Deleuze and Guattari because they expect, especially when reading a work of philosophy, to be gratified with a little sense. I have read from the pen of a reputable historian that writers and thinkers of the 1960 and 1970 avant-gardes spread a reign of terror in the use of language, and that the conditions for a fruitful exchange must be restored by imposing on the intellectuals a common way of speaking, that of the historians. I have been reading a young philosopher of language who complains that continental thinking, under the challenge of speaking machines, has surrendered to the machines the concern for reality, that it has substituted for the referential paradigm that of adlinguisticity, and who thinks that the time has now come to restore a solid anchorage of language in the referent. I have read a talented theatrologist for whom postmodernism, with its games and fantasies, carries very little weight in front of political authority, especially when a worried public opinion encourages authority to a politics of totalitarian surveillance in the face of nuclear warfare threats. I have read a thinker of repute who defends modernity against those he calls the neoconservatives. Under the banner of postmodernism, the latter would like, he believes, to get rid of the uncompleted project of modernism, that of the Enlightenment. Even the last advocates of Aufklärung, such as Popper or Adorno, were only able, according to him, to defend the project in a few particular spheres of life, that of politics for the author of The Open Society, and that of art for the author of Ästhetische Theory, Jürgen Habermas. Everyone had recognized him, thinks that if modernity has failed, it is in allowing the totality of life to be splintered into independent specialties which are left to the narrow competence of experts, while the concrete individual experiences desublimated meaning and destructured form, not as a liberation, but in the mode of that immense ennui which Baudelaire described over a century ago. Following a prescription of Albrecht Velmer, Habermas considers that the remedy for this splintering of culture and its separation from life can only come from changing the status of aesthetic experience when it is no longer primarily expressed in judgments of taste, but when it is used to explore a living historical situation, that is, when it is put in relation with problems of existence. For this experience, then, becomes a part of a language game, which is no longer that of aesthetic criticism. It takes part in cognitive processes and normative expectations. It alters the manner in which those different moments refer to one another. What Habermas requires from the arts and the experiences they provide is, in short, to bridge the gap between cognitive, ethical, and political discourses, thus opening the way to a unity of experience. My question is to determine what sort of unity Habermas has in mind. Is the aim of the project of modernity the constitution of socio-cultural unity, within which all the elements of daily life and of thought would take their places as in an organic whole? Or does the passage that has to be charted between heterogeneous language games, those of cognition, of ethics, of politics, belong to a different order from that? And if so, would it be capable of effecting a real synthesis between them? The first hypothesis, of a Hegelian inspiration, does not challenge the notion of a dialectically totalizing experience. The second is closer to the spirit of Kant's critique of judgment, but must be submitted, like the critique, to that severe re-examination which postmodernity imposes on the thought of the Enlightenment, on the idea of a unitary end of history and of a subject. It is this critique which not only Wittgenstein and Adorno have initiated, but also a few other thinkers, French or other, who do not have the honor to be read by Professor Habermas, which at least saves them from getting a poor grade for their neoconservatism. Realism. The demands I began by citing are not all equivalent. They can even be contradictory. Some are made in the name of postmodernism, others in order to combat it. It is not necessarily the same thing to formulate a demand for some referent in objective reality, for some sense in credible transcendence, for an addressee in audience, or an addresser in subjective expressiveness, or for some communicational consensus in a general code of exchanges, such as the genre of historical discourse. But in the diverse invitations to suspend artistic experimentation, there's an identical call for order, a desire for unity, for identity, for security, or popularity, in the sense of Öffentlichkeit, of finding a public. Artists and writers must be brought back into the bosom of the community, or at least, if the latter is considered to be ill, they must be assigned the task of healing it. There's an irrefutable sign of this common disposition. It is that for all those writers, nothing is more urgent than to liquidate the heritage of the avant-garde. Such is the case, in particular, of the so-called trans-avant-gardism. The answers given by Achille Bonito Oliva to the questions asked by Bernard Lamarche Vadel and Michel Henrique leave no room for doubt about this. By putting the avant-garde through a mixing process, the artist and critic feel more confident that they can suppress them than by launching a frontal attack, for they can pass off the most cynical eclecticism as a way of going beyond the fragmentary character of the preceding experiments, whereas if they openly turn their backs on them, they would run the risk of appearing ridiculously neo-academic. The salons and the academies, at the time when the bourgeoisie was establishing itself in history, were able to function as purgation and to grant awards for good plastic and literary conduct under the cover of realism. But capitalism inherently possesses the power to derealize familiar objects, social roles, and institutions to such a degree that the so-called realistic representations can no longer evoke reality except as nostalgia or mockery, as an occasion for suffering rather than for satisfaction. Classicism seems to be ruled out in a world in which reality is so destabilized that it offers no occasion for experience, but one for ratings and experimentation. This theme is familiar to all readers of Walter Benjamin, but it is necessary to assess its exact reach. Photography did not appear as a challenge to painting from the outside, any more than industrial cinema did to narrative literature. The former was only putting the final touch to the program of ordering the visible elaborated by the Quattrocento, while the latter was the last step in rounding off diachronies as organic wholes, which had been the ideal of the great novels of education since the 18th century. That the mechanical and the industrial should appear as substitutes for hand or craft was not in itself a disaster, except if one believes that art is in its essence the expression of an individuality of genius assisted by an elite craftsmanship. The challenge lay essentially in that photographic and cinematographic processes can accomplish better, faster, and with a circulation 100,000 times larger than narrative or pictorial realism, the task which academicism had assigned to realism, to preserve various consciousnesses from doubt. Industrial photography and cinema will be superior to painting and the novel whenever the objective is to stabilize the referent, to arrange it according to a point of view which endows it with a recognizable meaning, to reproduce the syntax and vocabulary which enable the addressee to decipher images and sequences quickly, and so to arrive easily at the consciousness of his own identity, as well as the approval which he thereby receives from others, since such structures of images and sequences constitute a communication code among all of them. This is the way the effects of reality, or if one prefers, the fantasies of realism, multiply. If they too do not wish to become supporters of minor importance at that, of what exists, the painter and novelist must refuse to lend themselves to such therapeutic uses. They must question the rules of the art of painting or of narrative, as they have learned and received them from their predecessors. Soon those rules must appear to them as a means to deceive, to seduce, and to reassure, which makes it impossible for them to be true. Under the common name of painting and literature, an unprecedented split is taking place. Those who refuse to re-examine the rules of art pursue successful careers. In mass conformism, by communicating by means of the correct rules, the endemic desire for reality, with objects and situations capable of gratifying it. Pornography is the use of photography and film to such an end. It is becoming a general model for the visual or narrative arts, which have not met the challenge of the mass media. As for the artists and writers who question the rules of plastic and narrative arts, and possibly share their suspicions by circulating their work, they are destined to have little credibility in the eyes of those concerned with reality and identity. They have no guarantee of an audience. Thus, it is possible to ascribe the dialectics of the avant-garde to the challenge posed by the realisms of industry and mass communication to painting and the narrative arts. Duchamp's ready-made does nothing but actively and parodistically signify this constant process of dispossession of the craft of painting, or even of being an artist. As Thierry de Duvet penetratingly observes, the modern aesthetic question is not what is beautiful, but what can be said to be art in literature. Realism, whose only definition is that it intends to avoid the question of reality implicated in that of art, always stands somewhere between academicism and kitsch. When power assumes the name of a party, realism and its neoclassical complement triumph over the experimental avant-garde by slandering and banning it. That is, provided the correct images, the correct narratives, the correct forms which the party requests, selects, and propagates, can find a public to desire them, as the appropriate remedy for the anxiety and depression that public experiences. The demand for reality, that is, for unity, simplicity, communicability, etc., did not have the same intensity, nor the same continuity in German society, between the two world wars, and in Russian society after the revolution. This provides a basis for a distinction between Nazi and Stalinist realism. What is clear, however, is that when it is launched by the political apparatus, the attack on artistic experimentation is specifically reactionary. Aesthetic judgment would only be required to decide whether such or such work is in conformity with the established rules of the beautiful. Instead of the work of art having to investigate what makes it an art object and whether it will be able to find an audience, political academicism possesses and imposes a priori criteria of the beautiful, which designates some works in a public at a stroke and forever. The use of categories in aesthetic judgment would thus be of the same nature as in cognitive judgment. To speak like Kant, both would be determining judgments. The expression is well formed, first in the understanding, then the only cases retained in experience are those which can be subsumed under this expression. When power is that of capital and not that of a party, the trans-avant-gardist, or postmodern solution, proves to be better adapted than the anti-modern solution. Eclecticism is the degree zero of contemporary general culture. One listens to reggae, watches a Western, eats McDonald's food for lunch and local cuisine for dinner, wears Paris perfume in Tokyo and retro clothes in Hong Kong. Knowledge is a matter for TV games. It is easy to find a public for eclectic works. By becoming kitsch, art panders to the confusion which reigns in the taste of the patrons. Artists, gallery owners, critics, and public wallow together in the anything goes, and the epoch is one of slackening. But this realism of the anything goes is in fact that of money. In the absence of aesthetic criteria, it remains possible and useful to assess the value of works of art according to the profits they yield. Such realism accommodates all tendencies, just as capital accommodates all needs, providing that the tendencies and needs have purchasing power. As for taste, there is no need to be delicate when one speculates or entertains oneself. Artistic and literary research is doubly threatened, once by the cultural policy and once by the art and book market. What is advised, sometimes through one channel, sometimes through the other, is to offer works which, first, are relative to subjects which exist in the eyes of the public they address, and second, works so made that the public will recognize what they are about, will understand what is signified, will be able to give or refuse its approval knowingly, and if possible, even to derive from such work a certain amount of comfort. The interpretation which has just been given of the contact between the industrial and mechanical arts, in literature and the fine arts, is correct in its outline, but it remains narrowly sociologizing and historicizing, in other words, one-sided. Stepping over Benjamin's and Adorno's reticences, it must be recalled that science and industry are no more free of the suspicion which concerns reality than are art and writing. To believe otherwise would be to entertain an excessively humanistic notion of the Mephistophelian functionalism of sciences and technologies. There's no denying the dominant existence today of technoscience, that is, the massive subordination of cognitive statements to the finality of the best possible performance, which is the technological criterion. But the mechanical and the industrial, especially when they enter fields traditionally reserved for artists, are carrying with them much more than power effects. The objects and the thoughts which originate in scientific knowledge and the capitalist economy convey with them one of the rules which supports their possibility, the rule that there is no reality unless testified by a consensus between partners over a certain knowledge and certain commitments. This rule is of no little consequence. It is the imprint left on the politics of the scientist and the trustee of capital by a kind of flight of reality out of the metaphysical, religious, and political certainties that the mind believed it held. This withdrawal is absolutely necessary to the emergence of science and capitalism. No industry is possible without a suspicion of the Aristotelian theory of motion, no industry without a refutation of corporatism, of mercantilism, and of physiocracy. Modernity, in whatever age it appears, cannot exist without a shattering of belief and without discovery of the lack of reality, together with the invention of other realities. What does this lack of reality signify if one tries to free it from a narrowly historicized interpretation? The phrase is, of course, akin to what Nietzsche calls nihilism. But I see a much earlier modulation of Nietzschean perspectivism in the Kantian theme of the sublime. I think in particular that it is in the aesthetic of the sublime that modern art, including literature, finds its impetus, and the logic of avant-garde finds its axioms. The sublime sentiment, which is also the sentiment of the sublime, is, according to Kant, a strong and equivocal emotion. It carries with it both pleasure and pain. Better still, in it pleasure derives from pain. Within the tradition of the subject, which comes from Augustine and Descartes, and which Kant does not radically challenge, this contradiction, which some would call neurosis or masochism, develops as a conflict between the faculties of a subject, the faculty to conceive of something, and the faculty to present something. Knowledge exists if first the statement is intelligible, and second if cases can be derived from the experience which corresponds to it. Beauty exists if a certain case, the work of art, given first by the sensibility without any conceptual determination, the sentiment of pleasure independent of any interest the work may elicit, appeals to the principle of a universal consensus, which may never be attained. Taste, therefore, testifies that between the capacity to conceive and the capacity to present an object corresponding to the concept, an undetermined agreement, without rules, giving rise to a judgment which Kant calls reflective, may be experienced as pleasure. The sublime is a different sentiment. It takes place, on the contrary, When the imagination fails to present an object, which might, if only in principle, come to match a concept, we have the idea of the world, the totality of what is, but we do not have the capacity to show an example of it. We have the idea of the simple, that which cannot be broken down, decomposed, but we cannot illustrate it with a sensible object which would be a case of it. We can conceive the infinitely great, the infinitely powerful, but every presentation of an object destined to make visible this absolute greatness or power appears to us painfully inadequate. Those are ideas of which no presentation is possible. Therefore, they impart no knowledge about reality, experience. They also prevent the free union of the faculties which gives rise to the sentiment of the beautiful, and they prevent the formation and the stabilization of taste. They can be said to be unpresentable. I shall call modern the art which devotes its little technical expertise to present the fact that the unpresentable exists, to make visible that there is something which can be conceived and which can neither be seen nor made visible. This is what is at stake in modern painting. But how to make visible that there is something which cannot be seen? Kant himself shows the way when he names formlessness, the absence of form, as a possible index to the unpresentable. He also says of the empty abstraction, which the imagination experiences when in search for a presentation of the infinite, another unpresentable. This abstraction itself is like a presentation of the infinite, its negative presentation. He cites the commandment, "Thou shalt not make graven images," as the most sublime passage in the Bible, in that it forbids all presentation of the absolute. Little needs to be added to those observations to outline an aesthetic of sublime paintings. As painting, it will of course present something, though negatively. It will therefore avoid figuration or representation. It will be white, like one of Malevich's squares. It will enable us to see only by making it impossible to see. It will please only by causing pain. One recognizes in those instructions the axioms of avant-garde in painting, inasmuch as they devote themselves to making an allusion to the unpresentable by means of visible presentations. The systems in the name of which, or with which, this task has been able to support, or to justify itself, deserve the greatest attention, but they can originate only in the vocation of the sublime in order to legitimize it, that is, to conceal it. They remain inexplicable without the incommensurability of reality to concept, which is implied in the Kantian philosophy of the sublime. It is not my intention to analyze here in detail the manner in which the various avant-gardes have, so to speak, humbled and disqualified reality by examining the pictorial techniques which are so many devices to make us believe in it. Local tone, drawing, the mixing of colors, linear perspective, the nature of the support and that of the instrument, the treatment, the display, the museum, the avant-gardes are perpetually fleshing out artifices of presentation, which make it possible to subordinate thought to the gaze and to turn it away from the unpresentable. If Habermas, like Marcuse, understands this task of derealization as an aspect of the repressive desublimation which characterizes the avant-garde, it is because he confuses the Kantian sublime with Freudian sublimation, and because aesthetics has remained for him that of the beautiful. The postmodern. What, then, is the postmodern? What place does it or does it not occupy in the vertiginous work of the questions hurled at the rules of image and narration? It is undoubtedly a part of the modern. All that has been received, if only yesterday, must be suspected. What space does Cézanne challenge? The Impressionists, what object do Picasso and Braque attack? Cézanne's. What presupposition does Duchamp break with in 1912? That which says one must make a painting, be it cubist. And Buren questions that other presupposition, which he believes had survived untouched by the work of Duchamp, the place of presentation of the work. In an amazing acceleration, the generations precipitate themselves. A work can become modern only if it is first postmodern. Postmodernism, thus understood, is not modernism at its end, but in the nascent state, and this state is constant. Yet I would like not to remain with this slightly mechanistic meaning of the word. If it is true that modernity takes place in the withdrawal of the real and according to the sublime relation between the presentable and the conceivable. It is possible, within this relation, to distinguish two modes. The emphasis can be placed on the powerlessness of the faculty of presentation, on the nostalgia for presence felt by the human subject, on the obscure and futile will which inhabits them in spite of everything. The emphasis can be placed rather on the power of the faculty to conceive, on its inhumanity, so to speak, since it is not the business of our understanding whether or not human sensibility or imagination can match what it conceives. The emphasis can also be placed on the increase of being and the jubilation which result from the invention of new rules of the game, be it pictorial, artistic, or any other. What I have in mind will become clear if we dispose very schematically a few names on the chessboard of the history of avant-garde. On the side of Melancholia, the German Expressionists, and on the side of Novatio, Braque and Picasso, on the former Malevich, and on the latter Lisitsky, on the one Chirico, and on the other Duchamp. The nuance which distinguishes these two modes may be infinitesimal. They often coexist in the same piece, are almost indistinguishable, and yet they testify to a difference on which the fate of thought depends and will depend for a long time between regret and essay. The work of Proust and that of Joyce both allude to something which does not allow itself to be made present. Allusion, to which Paulo Fabri recently called my attention, is perhaps a form of expression indispensable to the works which belong to an aesthetic of the sublime. In Proust, what is being alluded as the price to pay for this illusion is the identity of consciousness, a victim to the excess of time. But in Joyce, it is the identity of writing, which is the victim of an excess of the book or of literature. Proust calls forth the unpresentable by means of a language unaltered in its syntax and vocabulary, and of a writing which in many of its operators still belongs to the genre of novelistic narration. The literary institution, as Proust inherits it from Balzac and Flaubert, is admittedly subverted in that the hero is no longer a character, but the inner consciousness of time, and in that the diegetic diachrony, already damaged by Flaubert, is here put in question because of the narrative voice. Nevertheless, the unity of the book, the odyssey of that consciousness, even if it is deferred from chapter to chapter, is not seriously challenged. The identity of the writing with itself throughout the labyrinth of the interminable narration is enough to connote such unity, which has been compared to that of the phenomenology of mind. Joyce allows the unpresentable to become perceptible in his writing itself, in the signifier. The whole range of available narrative and even stylistic operators is put into play without concern for the unity of the whole, and new operators are tried. The grammar and vocabulary of literary language are no longer accepted as given. Rather, they appear as academic forms, as rituals originating in piety, which prevent the unpresentable from being put forward. Here, then, lies the difference. Modern aesthetics is an aesthetic of the sublime, though a nostalgic one. It allows the unpresentable to be put forward only as the missing contents, but the form, because of its recognizable consistency, continues to offer to the reader or viewer matter for solace and pleasure. Yet these sentiments do not constitute the real sublime sentiment, which is in an intrinsic combination of pleasure and pain, the pleasure that reason should exceed all presentation, the pain that imagination or sensibility should not be equal to the concept. The postmodern would be that which, in the modern, puts forward the unpresentable in presentation itself, that which denies itself the solace of good forms, the consensus of a taste which would make it possible to share collectively the nostalgia for the unattainable, that which searches for new presentations, not in order to enjoy them, but in order to impart a stronger sense of the unpresentable. A postmodern artist or writer is in the position of a philosopher. The texts they write, the work they produce, are not in principle governed by pre-established rules, and they cannot be judged according to a determining judgment by applying familiar categories to the text or to the work. Those rules and categories are what the work of art itself is looking for. The artist and the writer, then, are working without rules in order to formulate the rules of what will have been done. Hence the fact that work and text have the characters of an event. Hence also, they always come too late for their author, or what amounts to the same thing. Their being put into work, their realization always begin too soon. Postmodern would have to be understood according to the paradox of the future anterior. It seems to me that the essay is postmodern, while the fragment is modern. Finally, it must be clear that it is our business not to supply reality, but to invent delusions to the conceivable which cannot be presented. And it is not to be expected that this task will effect the last reconciliation between language games, and that only the transcendental illusion can hope to totalize them into a real unity. But Kant also knew that the price to pay for such an illusion is terror. The 19th and 20th centuries have given us as much terror as we can take. We have paid a high enough price for the nostalgia of the whole and the one, for the reconciliation of the concept and the sensible, of the transparent and the communicable experience. Under the general demand for slackening and for appeasement, we can hear the mutterings of the desire for a return of terror, for the realization of the fantasy to seize reality. The answer is, let us wage a war on totality. Let us be witnesses to the unpresentable. Let us activate the differences and save the honor of the name.